Hi, this is Paul. There's a really good section in the conversation between Jordan Peterson and Lawrence Krauss. Now, if you didn't catch the audio-only version of not the Krauss episode, but the week before, where he talked to the historian, you might have missed that Michaela made the announcement that they're going to do these one a week. Because of some health reasons for Jordan. And I think that those of you who are Christians, I think it's appropriate to pray for Jordan's health. Michaela said it's not a big deal, but, he's been continuing to struggle with some health issues, so that's important. So we're going to be having one of these a week, it seems. That's going to be the pacing that they're going to have. And overall, I found this to be a fun conversation. I had never seen Krauss in conversation. I like his shirt with the horses on it, but this section, the video really got interesting at this point.
To talk about all that, but it's really irrelevant because as actually a brilliant, I first realized it due to a colleague of mine at Harvard who was really the smartest person there in the physics department. He's now dead, Sidney Coleman. He said the proper thing to talk about is not the interpretation of quantum mechanics. It's the interpretation of classical mechanics, because the real world is quantum mechanical. And any classical picture we impose on it is going to be crazy.
Okay, now watch his language very carefully. The real world is quantum mechanical. What does he mean by real? Because real is going to come up a little bit later in the conversation. I think he wants to say the physical world, but he keeps using this word real. And we're going to have the same issues with the word objective. And this is where this gets interesting.
But you don't have to think of them as real. They're all just different approximations to a reality, an underlying reality, which...
And now notice how this definition of the word real keeps flipping around. And if he'd be a little bit more precise in his language and maybe talk about the physical world. And they says, well, even quantum mechanics is a model that attempts to approximate the physical world. But even quantum mechanics can only be an approximation.
Can't be described by any classical picture. So that's why all these classical pictures seem crazy, because none of them is complete.
Well, if you look at this psychologically, I'm going to refer to Piaget again. I mean, Piaget pointed out that we derive our concepts from our practical manipulations of things. So, for example, you might ask why is this one thing? I could say, well, it's five things.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, the question. And this is Peterson, and Peugeot keeps making the same argument too.
The question is, well, what's a thing?
Yeah.
Well, look, it moves as a unit. Therefore, it's a thing. So that's one. Well, it could be five if I broke it apart. Now it's two. Yeah. But the concept itself is predicated on our interactions at this scale. And so we're going to derive our sense of reality from our practical interactions at this scale. And your claim.
And then suddenly our sense of reality. Well, what do we mean by reality? We mean this interoperable world that defies our will, that we have in common with others, that is productive. We'll use a Vervaeke word. It's transjective. That's reality, and that's why I say, well, is Uncle Sam real? Well, real enough to get you to pay your taxes, real enough to get you to drive the speed limit, real enough to get you to value your passport, real enough. We don't mean is Uncle Sam physical. Well, what are the physical manifestations of Uncle Sam? Well, the Washington Monument, the temples in Washington, D.C. that are to Uncle Sam. So this word real is very slippery, but watch how often people will use it interchangeably with physical. And they should use physical, but they won't.
The claim of the quantum mechanics in general is that doesn't apply at the micro scale. So our intuitions are gone because our intuitions are predicated on our embodiment at this level of analysis.
Absolutely. In fact, the purpose of The Greatest Story Ever Told So Far, that particular book, is to say something remarkable. The world of our experience is an illusion. Now, I know I hate to say it.
Okay, now we're getting into Wilfrid Sellers, two eyes, right? The world of experience, it's the manifest image. It's an illusion. He's going to backpedal from that word. Then he's going to want to talk about the scientific image. And Peterson's going to go right at this here.
Because it breeds all sorts of mumbo jumbo and people start doing. But at a fundamental scale, at the small scales, everything.
Oh, okay. At a fundamental scale. What do you mean by that word? Now here, this is, okay, an emergent property. We're talking about what, a physical level, and it emerges up from there.
Thing that defines our universe, including matter.
Defines our universe. I mean, all of these words. There's a lot of fudge in this. A lot of fudge in a lot of those words.
And everything that defines our universe, including matter, and
see, now he's sort of taken matter out of the real. I mean, he's swimming in a world of fudge here.
And mass, really, the things that make the universe we experience are really accidents of our circumstances.
What does he mean by accidents? Or is he talking accidents as opposed to essences or substances? What does he mean? Well, he's going to tell us.
Rather than fundamental properties of the universe. So our universe...
Yeah, well, that's...
Well, fundamental properties. And where he's going to go is he's going to say, well, fundamental properties are things that don't end. They're constant. What's really interesting is, though, even though he makes an impassioned plea for the Big Bang, he almost implies that his vision of the world is a constant state universe, and anything that is not constant is in some ways delegitimized and pushed to the side.
That's something I would like, and we can do this again when we talk again, because I'm always curious about that leap into purposelessness. And one of the things I would like to ask you just briefly on that subject is, as the universe cools, we do see a gradual increase in at least one sort of important complexity.
Now, this reminds me of Sam's argument with John Vervaeke with respect to telos and evolution. Jordan seems to be making a similar argument to what Sam made.
Right. And that's the building of let's say, the building of the periodic table. Mm-hmm. And so atoms become more and more complex and sophisticated as the universe cools. That seems like a kind of directionality that's built into the structure itself. And it isn't, I mean...
Now, built into the structure itself, I think he's, again, we're using these words, but I think he wants to talk about physical development in the universe. That, initially there are these... there's hydrogen, there's helium, but later on, as time moves on, you get to the development of other elements and metals and these kinds of things. And so Peterson is looking at is there in fact some directionality? Is there, don't forget, sort of Jordan Peterson's thing is he's always trying to reconstitute the foundations of Christendom upon our Darwinian basis, and to see just how far he can get with it.
Do you think that's is that necessarily discontinuous with the radical increase in complexity that you start to see 3.5 billion years ago when life emerges?
So you've got sort of the complexity that you see as the periodic table unfolds in the physical development of the universe, and then you find life as sort of maybe a next level up. You see, Peterson is sort of working on a hierarchy of being, as it were. If gold is more complex than helium or hydrogen, and life is more complex than gold, if life is sort of anti-entropic, and I still haven't watched Harold Bloom's talk on the Stoa that my friend Rod and others have looked at and said, you got to really talk about that. But so we're dealing with Krauss here. And this is a very interesting argument that Peterson is putting together.
Or is that the same process of complexification?
Well, okay, it's a good question. And the answer is it's all momentary.
Oh, so all that counts is timelessness. Boy, that's awfully close to eternity in religious terms.
It's a momentary accident. It is true that
So if that's an accident, please tell me what in the universe is the substance or the essence. Because he starts with the Big Bang, smaller than an atom, and this enormous, and he's skeptical about, multiverses and these kinds of things. So basically, it's the vision in your head of between a certain period after the Big Bang and then before the end? I mean, where is this timelessness if it's not simply the monarchical vision that modernity attempts to create in order to see the world through? And he's saying, well, Peterson's challenging him on this and say, well, when?
Stars, as individual stars evolve, they build up heavier and heavier elements. Okay, they do it at the expense of their surroundings by increasing the disorder in their surroundings. Right, they're emitting energy.
Right.
Okay, so there's no
there's localized.
Yeah.
There's localized increase in complexity, like us.
Yeah, but it's all
okay. So it's localized. So now we're dealing with time, space, in a sense.
Momentary.
Okay, there's localized increase in complexity, like us.
Yeah, but it's all momentary.
So in other words, you want to stop it, and then is that? Well, it sounds a lot like the end of the age and the life of the age to come. It sounds a lot like this fundamental realm he's imagining that is not like any realm he can point to, but it's just living in his head, is sort of heaven.
If you follow it long enough, the heavy elements are going to disappear, matter's going to disappear, and the long term, the universe will just be pure radiation again. Mm-hmm.
So what really counts, the fundamental essence of the universe is nothing.
Buildup of complexity, which you're absolutely true, is not a direction of the universe. It's a momentary but fortunate imbalance.
We're just riding the imbalance, baby.
That will exist for a while until the universe catches up with it.
And so the universe is basically nothing. That seems to be what he's saying. There's no telos. There's no endpoint. It's sort of, we're a blip and then we're gone. Ooh, I feel a meaning crisis coming on.
Yeah, well, that's a real problem in discussing concepts, isn't it? Because you can take a time scale and change the time scale, and all of a sudden the phenomena changes completely.
Absolutely.
That's what people do to themselves often when they think about the meaninglessness of their life. It's like,
it's a meaning crisis.
Well, wait a second. I could make the case, and I've made this with my clients approximately, is if you're thinking on a time scale that makes your life irrelevant, that's the wrong time scale for the problem. That's the hopelessness is an indication that you're using the wrong frame.
Now, what's interesting is that implicit in his argument with his clients is that there's a goal, because hopefulness is better than hopelessness. And this is what he's trying to move his clients towards. But is that fundamental, or is it, to go back to the other word, illusory? And if it's illusory, it's arbitrary. And in other words, there's no pattern that's here. Now what this sort of reminded me of is the video that I posted today, which was John Vervaeke's talk about nominalism, which is a deeply entrenched nominalism. And nominalism is the idea. I'm trying not to use too much. But nominalism is the idea coming from Duns Scotus and Occam. I talk about this a bit in my series. And this is where Jonathan is more radical than people realize, Jonathan Pajot. Because nominalism claims basically there are no real patterns. Right? There are no real patterns. The patterns are only patterns in our mind. Now, where are these patterns that Lawrence Krauss is looking at? Well, all these patterns are momentary. In fact, you can look at everything that he studies, his entire physics, and you say, well, but it's all just going to be radiation at some point. So these patterns have to live somewhere. Where are these patterns? Our mind is what links things together and makes the patterns. All that's out there are raw, absurd individuals, absurd in the very technical sense of absurd. Like they have, ultimately in themselves, they have no categorical meaning. There are no universals, all that kind of stuff. And you might imagine that if you apply what John had just said to Lawrence Krauss's momentary blip that we are right now, that's all we are. And see, once you think that, then you're put in this very weird position where all that the patterns are just in your mind, and then you just have to get them to rationally cohere with each other. The mind, somehow the patterns are real in your mind, and the mind knows them directly, but there's no patterns in the world, and the mind doesn't know them. And so a powerful dualism opens up between the mind and the world. And you're going to get Descartes and Kant. Now, this doesn't exactly map onto Krauss's dualism, but wait and see what Krauss is going to answer next, because Peterson kind of throws him a bone here, says, yeah, when my clients come in and say, well, nothing really matters because, and they don't use Krauss's, more elegant words to say, when it's all just done, there's just be radiation left. I mean, my kid, my job, my life, my goals, my ambitions, my dreams, desires, it's just going to be radiation.
Absolutely.
And you'd say, well, what's the proof of that? And I would say, well, the hopelessness is the proof of that. Now, you might know.
And that's a really interesting turn with Peterson. Well, the hopelessness is the proof of that, because the hopelessness is negative, unless, of course, but the hopelessness and the hopefulness, well, what's the difference between those things? Well, we call one positive because biologically it feels better for us and we tend to thrive. But again, all that thriving is going to get dumped into the same radiation death as everything else. So, and John Vervaeke talks about this time aspect too. And this whole finite thing, I don't really buy, because someone says, well, let's see, you've been kidnapped by terrorists and you're strapped to a chair, and they're going to use dental instruments on you to extract information from you because somehow they had you confused with some important government official and they want to get information out of you and you don't have it. And so they're going to torture you until you die. And you say, well, at least doesn't the finitude of it make it better? Well, sort of. Maybe torture me until I die. And this finitude argument doesn't really cut it for me.
I don't regard that as proof, but it's a point that's at least worth considering. Because you could say, well, what good is a Beethoven symphony across a span of 1 trillion years? It's like, well, none. But why? What good is posing that question?
Yeah, well, exactly. Well,
psychologically, when we enjoy something, do we enjoy the Beethoven symphony if we're told, when you're done with the symphony, you'll never hear it again? Or do you enjoy it more when you hear it and say, wow, that was good? And then someone says, would you like to hear it again? Or maybe, would you like to hear it not in a recording on YouTube Music, but how about in a concert hall with a full symphony around you? I'd rather hear that than, oh, this is more meaningful because you'll never hear it again. I don't buy that argument.
I couldn't agree with you more. The fact that we have, there's no obvious purpose to the universe, the fact that we and everything we've created will long be gone, that can depress you. But the opposite side of the coin, it seems to me, if I were a clinician, that I would try to argue to my clients, is that it makes every moment of that accident of your own existence special.
And this is exactly the argument at the end of The Good Place, that this all has meaning. And in fact, if you watch videos of the philosopher that helped put the show together, this is exactly the argument he has. It's meaningful because it's finite. Okay, so let me ask you this question. You've given birth, or your spouse has just given birth to a child. And you say, it's more meaningful if the child dies right now. No. It's more meaningful if the doctor says the child is healthy. And you immediately begin to build in your imagination a life with this child. A life where the child goes from an infant to, just something that cries and keeps you up at night. And 6 months from now, the child will start looking at you in your eyes and you get the child to smile. And then the child will start to walk. And then child will start to talk and name you by name and discover its world. And it will go to school and it will go to college and it'll have a career and it'll marry and it will reproduce. And no, it's more meaningful if the child dies. No, there's Peterson's earlier. There's something, I've been thinking about this for a while, actually. There's a natural telos in us that builds to things. It seems like every conversation in some ways invites the hope of a friendship. And every friendship in some ways invites the hope to a deeper friendship. And every conversation in some ways invites the hope for deeper and better conversations. And perhaps a romantic look invites it, sort of increases the desire for an embrace, and on and on and on and on. There is when we begin many things, there is sort of an anticipation. Now, not everything goes to its end, but that seems to me to be far more satisfying and joyful and meaningful. And I think that's something deep with respect to meaning. Now, Peterson's going to challenge him here.
And every instant is more special because it's finite. Because
so the birth of your child is more special if the child dies. Or it's more special because your child will someday die. No, it's special because the hope of the child is a relationship and fatherhood and grandparenthood and a future, and that's built into us
because it's so unique. And therefore, you're right, there may be no cosmic purpose to your existence, but you create your own purpose. I know you write about meaning, you wrote a whole book about meaning, but...
And that's where this seems to sort of map onto this nominalism. Well, there is no cosmic purpose. What do you mean that there's... And what really surprises me about this line from this particular tribe of people is these are the ones that want to hawk rationality. And what is rationality? Now, again, I've got Vervaeke's. I think Vervaeke is right that rationality is not just this simple correspondence, but rationality is seeing the child and beginning to set up a life for that child. We're going to get the room ready, and we've painted it blue because it's a boy. And, women seem to like that. I don't care. I don't care what color it is, but blue because it's a boy. And then we're going to buy clothing, and we're going to bring the child to the grandparents, and we're going to bring the child to church and have the child baptized, and the entire community around us is going to celebrate. And then we're going to, as the child grows, we're going to bring toys into its life and fulfillment. I mean, there's this entire thing. And rationality is all about looking at a distance and seeking a goal. Because in some ways, well, hydrogen is cool and helium is cool, but gold is cool and coal is cool, and the accumulation of those atoms. And then if you put the carbon together, and then maybe you can build something out of the carbon, and you can add iron, and you can make steel, and that's what rationality is about. Rationality is the purposeful, intensive thing in the universe. And what implicit, I think, in his argument is that rationality is just another blip. And he goes on in this video to laud science, and well, your science is just a blip too. And okay, it's cool. It's fireworks. Psh, it's gone. I don't buy it.
But I would argue there's no objective meaning to the universe. We make our own meaning.
Okay. Well, Peterson's going to call him on this.
And to the extent we make our own meaning, our lives are more or less valuable to us.
Sort of trapped in our head, though, isn't it? It's sort of a nominalism. There's nothing out there. It's just in here. It's just whatever I project onto the universe. The other problem that gets pointed out all the time with these is morality, because, and Lewis points this out, because if meaning is, and this is where sort of meaning and morality are similar. Because if meaning is just a projection of our mind onto the universe, then morality is too. And those who want to construct an objective morality, well, even Rationality Rules accepts that we have to sneak in a telos. You have to sneak in some kind of goal. Well, rationality, that's part of this whole blip too. And so if you find it meaningful because it's just a prisoner of your head, or maybe you have a group around you who find some heinous thing to do meaningful, upon what will you construct your moral argument against people who are doing things that are against it? Morality seems to be part of that same meaningful universe.
And to others around us. And so I would
I would quibble with that. And maybe it's not just a quibble, because I don't think meaning is something we create. I think it's something that manifests itself to us. Now,
see, and this is where he's sort of connecting with, now we've got emanation. So when he says it manifests itself, that's the language he always uses for an idea comes in, an insight comes in, something comes into our mind. It manifests itself. Well, what is that? It's meaning, again, this is back to C.S. Lewis, The Abolition of Man, Coleridge's Waterfall. That meaning is something out there that we connect to. It's something, see, objective, and Peterson's going to say, well, that's really the wrong word.
Look, I know it's not that simple because we do make decisions, but it's very frequently the case, and you know this as a scientist. For example, you may have a moment of insight into some phenomena, so that's deeply meaningful, but it isn't so much that is something you create, although you can seek it out. It's more like that's something that bursts on you.
From above.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it'll be an interesting question to see if we're debating semantics here or not.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean just a misunderstanding? No, I don't think so. Unless you just say that the insight is also locked in your own head, too, and part of that non-fundamental universe, and your science is going with that as well.
Right.
And well, I mean, I guess at a fundamental scale, and maybe we can follow this up in our in.
Oh, there's that word again, fundamental.
And when we talk in my podcast, but I tend not to think that there's any objective meaning to the universe.
There it is again. There's no objective. Well, what do you mean no objective? Well, you can't. Okay. So if you go all the way back to where he's talking about the singularity and the Big Bang. And the laws of physics don't apply until after the Big Bang. So are they arbitrary? Are they, time wasn't yet? This stuff just doesn't cohere.
Existence.
Well, it may be that objective and meaning aren't well suited for one another, right? Because you could also make the case that the objective viewpoint precludes meaning as part of its operation. Yeah. And I think you can make a strong case that the scientific method is designed to exclude subjective meaning. That's actually one of its remarkable strengths, but it has a cost. The cost is, well, what do you do with the phenomena of meaning? Well, it doesn't exist scientifically. Well, that is something we could talk about for a long time because that'll pull us into the question of whether what's conceptualized as objective reality is a sufficiently sophisticated conception of reality itself.
Back to maps of meaning. And again, often they want the word physical again, because objective means public. Construe the world as a world of objects.
And it isn't obvious to me that it is, because it does have this tendency to exclude the subjective by its method.
Okay, that's good because I would.
And now we're getting into the end of modernity.
I would say it's perfectly fine. The fact that it excludes the subjective is its strength, not its weakness, in my opinion.
Well, it is one of its strengths. There's no doubt about that.
But you've just covered one eye and said, made an evaluation, made it a value judgment, which you can't do with science. There's no value judgments here. Say, the strength of covering my other eye is that there are no value judgments.
Because by excluding the subjective, you can discover what's transpersonally universal. Mm-hmm. But that also may mean that there are things
What's transpersonally universal? That's the goal. And in some ways, again, we're back to a monarchical vision. We're back to, we want to get a picture, a still of what's fundamental in the universe without all of these accidents like the things on the periodic table. Or life. Or, well, what have you left in your fundamental picture?
Exclude that are real, that are necessary.
Necessary. Yeah, that's what you're looking for. You're looking for a foundation. You're looking for something fundamental.
I used to read. Well, there's I like Oliver Sacks, so I used to read a lot. And one of his last books before he died was on hallucinations. And one of the things that really, at the beginning of his book, that really hit me, and it was relevant to something I was working on at the time, and I honestly forget it, but is his point that to people who are experiencing hallucinations, they're real. And
yeah.
Yeah, well, that's the thing about real. Real is there is objectively real. Let's make no mistake about that. And objectively real is power.
Okay, what do you mean by objectively real? I mean, objectively has become an intensifier for like really real. And again, I think we got to clean up our language, because do you mean physical? Do you mean it governs? What do I mean governs? Well, do you mean it shapes minds and people and behaviors? Then we're sort of using the word spiritual.
Powerful, but it isn't obvious to me that objective and real are synonymous.
Well, when it comes, so,
ouch.
When it comes to our own psyche, I couldn't agree with you more. Which is why I tell people, by the way, when I was a kid, I wanted to be what I would have if neither of my parents went to university, so I didn't know the term neuroscience. So I wanted to be a brain surgeon. My mother wanted me to be a doctor, a nice Jewish boy, and I wanted to be. And what interested me most was the brain. And I thought, well, neurosurgery must be the way to do it. I didn't realize it wasn't. But one of the reasons I do physics is it's so much damn easier. It's just so much easier than psychology or neuroscience.
This is fascinating because he's right, of course, and he sees it that, and this is a point that Peterson made, it's a debatable point in some ways, that human beings are more complex than the rest of the universe, at least the universe that we know. Physics, well, why? Well, what's he doing with physics? Well, he's trying to take a snapshot of the world and describe it. And the problem with people and meaning and purpose and all of this is that it's much more of a moving target. Physics is the study of death. And human beings, it's life.
Because of these complexities of psyche. And so I do go back to this reason is a slave of passion. I mean, the fact that our whole understanding of our own existence is not really based on reason. I try as a scientist
well,
to
it's
do it.
Certainly not based on our capacity to what would you say, to conceptualize objective reality. That isn't how people think. Christ, we've only thought like that for 500 years.
Yeah,
it's really powerful, but
we've only pretended with each other and made it a social status marker for 500 years. We tried some of this, but we had the lab leak, and now we don't know that take your hand off your eye. My hand isn't on my eye. I'm seeing the world objectively.
It's not the way we naturally, and that's also something that's greatly mysterious to me.
Well,
it's not the way we naturally. Oh boy, there's a word that snuck in.
Well, but that's what's so wonderful about science to me is there's a recognition that scientists are people, which is a secret that most people don't realize, and therefore they're subject to all of the whims and slings and arrows of fortune, and so the scientific method is developed to realize that scientists are bound to make mistakes.
And who developed the scientific method? Did you find it looking through a telescope? Did you dig it up in some mysterious place in the world? Or was that also a function of this?
And be human. And the scientific method is to catch those mistakes. I argued recently, in fact, at Oxford Union, and they didn't get the point because they're all woke, but the students, but there were, there was a debate.
And Jordan is like, "Happy birthday to me."
It's terrible. That's a terrible thing.
I know,
if that's the case. It's so terrible.
You'll be surprised. There was a debate on, the question was, we are all religious. And I asked to speak on the pro side. My colleagues, my atheist colleagues, people were on the anti side, and they were shocked that I wanted to speak on the pro side. And my argument was quite simple. If we weren't all religious, we wouldn't need science. if we didn't all want to believe.
Right. That's exactly right, man. That's exactly right.
Okay, so we agree. I mean, they didn't get the point. And
I get the point. Now all three of us are in agreement. But the question is your science. Because now again, this is a powerful tool to tell us to help error correct between each other about significant things in the physical universe, and we can sometimes go beyond that, but you get much beyond it physically, and you just can't help but uncover the other eye.
Yeah, well, that was part of what I was trying to point out to Sam Harris, is that, and this is something I learned at least in part from reading Jung. Like, his claim was that alchemy, the ideas of alchemy grew out of a religious foundation, and then science emerged out of alchemy. Yeah. It's like it's nested. Science is nested inside an alchemical fantasy that's nested inside a religious fantasy.
Well, I wouldn't say nested. I would say it grew
out of? No. He basically said it's still nested. That's what he basically said, with all scientists are religious.
Out of it. Like I was born from my mother and father who, you know, and I like to think that that a lot of who I am is that, but I grew out of it.
Here's what.
I don't know what space he's growing out of it into.
Why I think it has to be nested still.
Okay.
Now, and this is something we could talk about a lot. The objects that draw a scientist's attention aren't determined by scientific processes. The fantasy, you see what I mean?
The objects aren't drawing them. The scientist is, and this is his talk with Sam Harris. And it's Vervaekean relevance realization.
Is that you get interested in some things and you pursue those. Now that's informed by your scientific knowledge, but it's so Jung's point, for example, was that science was a materialist redemptive myth that grew up as a counterposition to the spiritualist redemptive myth, right? So
I should pause that. And again, I don't know where in Jung that is treated, but let's think about, I mean, he's sort of, well, you're looking at Newton and, you know, the strange stuff that Newton is. Again, I'll go back to my phrasing of this. These were Christians who wanted to know God better. And one way to know God was to live in the monastery and pray and to be in church. Another way was to watch the ball drop and to measure it. This was pursuit of the knowledge of God, number one. Because this is how God spoke, through history, through time, through events. So if you want to, in that sense, know God, study the world, general revelation.
Imagine there was an idea, which was that we could redeem our inadequacy through spirit.
Now, redeem our inadequacy. Or, again, I was read Lewis when he talks about science and magic, or build a tower to the heavens and bring on the kingdom of God with science. And again, I'm not saying that's necessarily by any means an adulterous prospect or an idolatrous prospect. But I think Jung's insight is very interesting. Again, Peterson makes this point repeatedly.
Spiritual discipline. Okay, we tried that for a long time. It wasn't enough. People were still suffering from leprosy. Okay, so there's a fantasy emerges over thousands of years. Maybe we should investigate the transformations of matter. There's redemptive information residing in the transformations of matter. We could investigate that, and that would make life better. And so the
But again, once you say better, you're into the manifest image.
Motivational goal behind science is the expansion of human competence. And that's not a scientific goal. That's a motivational goal.
Yeah, I agree with you. But where I guess that we disagree, and we could have this discussion, is that I think you're right. And that's what I said before. Scientists are people. So they're motivated by all. They're motivated by greed, by fame, by jealousy, as well as by facts.
By awe,
and wonder. I mean, I would, I want to point out, I mean, we're all, that's why I'm a scientist. I'm demonstrating about awe and wonder.
People find scientific pursuits meaningful.
And fascination. But I'm also, the questions I ask are partly determined by the time in which I live. But I don't want to be postmodern, because the point is that what's great, so that's all true from a psychological perspective. So you may say that the motivations of science are kind of a personal fantasy. But what's great is the science.
What's great? Try saying this without a value judgment. Please, go ahead. Give it a shot. I dare you. It can't be done.
Overcomes that, so that you're right. There are, in fact, if you, in my book, in the book you read, the greatest story ever told so far, I make a big point of saying scientists were all moving in this direction, and it was the wrong direction.
But it doesn't overcome the motivation. It doesn't overcome the motivation. It overcomes the contamination of the theory by the motivational impulse.
But the motivation changes because the results force it upon you. Scientists are forced, kicking and screaming, to change their minds. They don't want.
With respect to what kind of truth? Propositional. Part of we've talked a lot about propositional truth and the way that propositional truth sort of takes over religion in the modern period and Protestantism, absolutely. But the kind of error correction he's looking for is propositional error correction. Because your procedural, your perspectival, your participatory are much more in the quest of the manifest image. And so your science, your world of objects, your bucket of facts, it's propositional. And well, he creates the value judgment that propositional bucket is beautiful, and he's going to talk about that later. Beautiful, beautiful. Is a fact beautiful, or does it just is in your scientific vision?
Want to, but that motivation of the kind of questions you ask and that's the greatness of science, because it's empirical, because it's not.
The motivation isn't empirical. Peterson's right.
Based on just what I want, but what nature tells me is the case, and so eventually
nature tells you. Why do you have to work so hard for it? It's almost like you're the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, and you're, oh, God of science, deliver the facts to us.
All the scientists who want this and no doubt were driven in that direction because they wanted that, find out that want is wrong, and they have to go over here. And that's
I need my propositions corrected.
Beauty of science. It's that nature determines what's beautiful ultimately.
Nature determines the value judgments, huh?
There was a while when string theorists talked about the elegant universe and all that. Elegant and beauty don't matter. Nature determines it, not scientists.
Which nature? The nature in you, the nature that is built in you to like symmetrical faces, the nature that's built into the baby to like faces. And for a while in the 90s, we put up all these little faces in front of our babies because it was supposed to make them smarter.
And eventually we get drawn until we eventually come to a picture where we think it's beautiful, but it was nature.
But I thought all this stuff was just the accidents, And again, I just think about Lewis and in The Abolition of Man. Well, then he suddenly stands up and speaks like a man with a chest.
Something that was incredibly ugly in the beginning that we thought was ugly ends up being beautiful, because we force our picture to understand that that's the way it really is, and then
that's the way it really is. I mean, what blows me away is there's all this denying of this entire world, and then you stand up and speak like, C.S. Lewis complains about H.G. Wells and others, that on one hand they're telling me that all of this is nothing, and then suddenly they stand up and they proclaim like a preacher.
We develop an understanding of it. But so that's the beauty. It's that I guess I don't think of it as a fantasy in that sense. Maybe the motivation is fantastical, and even the process at some levels.
Well, there's a proposition, right? Which I think look. Let me give you another example of this, and you tell me what you think.
Okay.
Okay. So, I'll try to formulate this properly.
No, I won't was the wave number one. Number two is, let me tell you about this and tell me what you think.
Although I may not be able to do it. We have a hypothesis that's a fantasy, I would say, that the increase of knowledge through technical means will be of benefit to.
Now, what does he mean by fantasy? It means a desirous mental image.
Us as individuals and as a species. Okay, that is a fantasy. Now, it may be accurate. It's the fantasy that we've staked ourselves on, but it's not provable, and we're actually ambivalent about it because we generate apocalyptic nightmares all the time, and we know that our technological prowess has a Frankenstein element. Sure. So it's not like we're 100% convinced that this nonstop onslaught of knowledge generation is necessarily in our best interests. And you could also make a case, an evolutionary case, that most species are stunningly conservative. If something works, man, they do not deviate from it, whereas we're just transforming like mad. And so we do have this fantasy, which is we can escape our static destiny by the acquisition of knowledge, by going out into the unknown. That's Star Trek, right? Yeah. You wrote books on the physics of Star Trek, to go boldly where no one has gone before. Yeah. And that will be of net benefit to us. And that's the fantasy within which this is nested. I don't think that does change.
Benefit, I mean, that's all manifest image stuff.
You know,
I mean, I understand your point. Within that, there's transformations constantly.
I think it wouldn't. Well, look, I agree with you to the most part. And in fact, regarding the apocalyptic things, one of the things you didn't mention is that I was chairman of the board of sponsors of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist for a dozen years that sets the doomsday clock. So every year I'd have to stare apocalypse right in the face. But
now, didn't that finitude of impending nuclear war just make everything beautiful? I kid you not. I hear this stuff and I think, this is madness.
I think the reason that fantasy has persisted, I would argue, is that it, like many fantasies, is that it has an evolutionary success. And the reason
I agree.
And the reason that it persists is that we have found that, when we developed antibiotics, we can live longer. I mean, so there's a hope. And you're right.
So that sounds a lot like reason and meaning, and finding meaning by imagining a future and working towards that future and developing antibiotics and progress and making life better. I mean, again, just when I started this video, that just all goes away with a hand wave. And now it's church.
Comes back to what I said before. Reason is a slave of passion. I recognize that when I think I'm being driven by pure rationality, I have to recognize that there's passion behind it.
Well, that's it. This is so okay. And I think part of that, again, this is something I tried to draw out my conversations with Harris, is, well, we are evolved biological creatures. We're motivationally driven. We have a pattern. We are not rational. That's wrong. Now we can learn to.
And that meaning, I mean, why do we strive to live longer? Why is that so meaningful?
Be rational with great difficulty.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, and maybe that's a tool, but there is underneath this, you said it was an instinct. So we could take that apart a little bit. Yeah. So the prefrontal cortex grew out of the motor cortex. Mm-hmm. So the motor cortex enables you to engage in voluntary activity. Yeah. The prefrontal cortex enables you to abstractly represent motor activity, play it out in an avatar-like universe, and kill off stupid ideas before they kill you. So we've evolved to produce hypotheses.
And we find this to be astoundingly meaningful. And, and again, this idea of, well, it's finitude, and that gives us joy. And it's sort of like Sophie's choice. Well, at least she has a choice. And it's like, no. No, Sophie's choice is a choice that no one wants to make.
Test them through dialectic often, and dispense with those that don't work. And so we've staked ourselves on that attempt, and we've evolved to be able to do that. And science, I believe, is the extension of that, the practical.
And what drives so much of it is meaning. And meaning is in many ways the fuel of that engine.
Extension of that.
The most successful
so that's all
extension, I would argue.
Yes, it's well, so successful so far, right?
Yeah, so far.
We have the time frame problem.
Yeah, exactly.
So on the apocalyptic end, let me ask you what you think of this. So we have a particular view of a hydrogen atom.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's very reductionistic, right? And you can see the power of that because we understand hydrogen atoms well enough to turn them into bombs.
Yeah.
But you could...
Some of you might remember my Tiger Bombs video.
Also argue that it's because of the limitations of that form of knowledge that we were inclined to turn them into bombs, that we separated the hydrogen atom from its context, its broad context. It enabled us to manipulate a tiny fragment of reality to exclude the rest of reality from that consideration. That bestowed upon us a tremendous power, but look what it produced.
And that, I would agree, I think Peterson is making his point that this one-eyed manipulation of the hydrogen atom was driven by the other eye, that this is what we're going to make so we can be safe from our enemies, the Ruskies.
The hydrogen bomb. And, that could be evidence that the theory, however practically useful for producing deadly machinery, was not useful at all at a larger scale of analysis. And that's the paradox, I guess, of the reductionistic approach.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like, reminds me of the Sorcerer's Apprentice, a movie with Mickey Mouse or whatever it was, I think
Mickey Mouse. Yeah.
And is the sense that it is a remarkable. Well, or maybe I should do Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. But which may be a summary of your book. But anyway,
responsibility and morality are in bed together there.
We have this weird, I can't agree with you more. We have this weird dichotomy. We've discovered science. The scientific method was
we've discovered it, or we've developed it.
Discovery. It took a while to discover it. When the Greeks didn't have it, they did a lot, but if they'd been able to know about empirical evidence, they would have done a lot more.
So where did we discover it? Where was it lying where we found it? Or did we develop it?
And so it was a discovery, and it's a discovery that was incredibly powerful, that works.
Because it's funny, because before, meaning is something that, we don't discover it. It doesn't appear down into it. We make it. But science comes from above.
But we humans, didn't evolve to discover the scientific method. I mean, we had the capability, and therefore we had.
Because there's no purpose in the universe, so it wasn't. There was no purpose in us discovering it. There's no providence. It just, we walked along one day and science, there it was.
We have all sorts of evolutionary baggage that makes us human. And so we're, on the one hand, have this incredible power by using the scientific method, but on the other hand, have the fact that we are human. And we have all the slings and arrows that came with being human, all of the evolutionarily positive and negative features of having developed a psyche as you described it. One with, I had a podcast with Joseph Ledoux. I don't know if you know him.
Yeah,
We talked a great deal about fear in the amygdala and how those things play out. But so we have the people that are manipulating this scientific method who are subject to all of the concerns that may.
People who are manipulating the scientific method. Oh, like you manipulate your neighbor? Or people who are employing the scientific method in order to what? I don't know. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's enough. But I just don't buy any of this. I don't know what kind of a physicist he is, but when it comes to these kinds of questions, he's just all over the place. Leave a comment. Tell me what you know.